Tom, great to have you back with us to talk about the economic situation in the world. There's a ton happening in the world right now with the crisis in the Ukraine and Russia. We want to get you to talk about that from the vantage point of its impacts on the rural economy here in the United States, and also connect it up with the interest rate environment as well. So we're looking forward to your comments on those subjects.
Great to be with you as always, Arthur. It's oddly, since we're exiting COVID, we're doing this remotely, but only because I'm actually in physical proximity with hundreds of our customers on the road.
Right, and thank you for doing this in virtual format. So let's start with, and I'll say out of the gate, it sounds weird to be saying this in this way, but let's start with the war in Europe. The Russia-Ukraine crisis has dominated the headlines over the last several weeks. I think people who followed that know that that region is a super important area in terms of not only energy commodities, but agricultural commodities as well. Just give us your take on the situation and as it now stands, and what you're thinking about in terms of the crisis going forward.
Well, that's a great question about which I could speak all day, as you can probably imagine. I would start out, however, by saying this is a moment of moral clarity in the world, which doesn't happen very often. It is dramatically changing international relations and the international economy in a way that we haven't seen since the end of the Cold War 30 years ago. So we are exiting one phase of international history and entering a new phase, which is going to be quite different in a variety of different ways. It also has to be said that it is, obviously we'll talk about some of the economic consequences, but it is a dramatic human tragedy for literally tens of millions of people in Ukraine, to be sure, but also in the region. And we need to keep that in the forefront of our mind as well. The consequences, both politically but also economically, are tremendously significant. And one need only recognize the fact that Ukraine and Russia together are very significant players in some of the agricultural and input supply markets that are so important for the United States in general, but for our agriculture and agribusiness customers in particular. For example, the wheat exports from the region are about 29% of world exports, corn about 17%, and potash about 37%. And since right now every port in Ukraine is closed and no shipper on the planet can get insurance to try and take a ship to a Ukrainian port, the entire complex in terms of production and export and physical logistics is completely shut off from the world economy. That is going to have very dramatic impacts, and frankly already has, because it took an already tight world supply and demand situation for some of those products and made it dramatically tighter and with dramatically more downside from a supply perspective and therefore upside from a price perspective, which is why some of these prices have risen so dramatically so quickly.
In terms of just the duration of the crisis in this area of ag commodities and its impacts there, do you think we're talking months? Do you think we're talking years? Do we not know yet?
Well, we don't know how this is all going to play out, but I have this conversation with people every day, and I would tell you that that this war is very significant, and it is going to be a long slog, because for better or worse, Vladimir Putin is not somebody who's likely to declare that he made a mistake, change his mind, and pull his troops out of Ukraine, short of achieving some of his objectives. And since achieving some of his objectives is so demonstrably difficult, and since he's so dramatically miscalculated, the ease of achieving his military objectives and the ferocious response from the Ukrainians themselves, as well as from the Western world and the international community, we're in for a long, gruesome, carnage-inducing conflict that's going to last months, not days or weeks. And therefore, the impact on the markets that our customers are in and where prices and supply-demand dynamics will be affected is likely to go on for some time. So, for example, the longer this goes on, the less likely it is that there will be a successful planting of agricultural products in Ukraine that will ultimately yield a 2022 wheat crop that could be exported to other places in the world. Those farmers are not only unable to get into the field, they're volunteering to carry rifles and fight the Russian army. So this is going to be a long, consequential conflict that is going to make some of the supply-demand dynamics in world commodity markets that were already lasting longer than we would have expected if we'd had this conversation a year ago, is going to make them likely last even longer.
Let's bring up another chart that's relevant to what you just said. It's an index chart that shows the prices for wheat and corn and fertilizer from the beginning of the year, and you can see the big spike up in February as a result of the Ukraine crisis. From the vantage point of U.S. farmers at the production layer of the value chain here, do you think that the increased revenue from higher crop prices will more than offset the potentially increased input prices, um, and therefore be a net economic benefit here? Is it? Do we know that? What are you thinking about that?
So far, for the most part, people's incremental revenue opportunity through the higher prices of their product has exceeded the incremental growth in input costs and the like, and therefore has not been margins have not been eroded away completely, right? So they haven't lost all of that incremental price, but a lot of it's gone away, right? But the agricultural production complex in the United States is the most efficient and price responsive and market responsive in the world. And there will be a big supply response, and as a consequence of these prices and these opportunities, and people will try to capture that incremental earnings as dramatically and as rapidly as they can, even in the knowledge that some of that margin compression will occur because of higher input prices, be that fertilizer or other inputs.
A follow-up question about in the agricultural sector, and we'll go up a layer in the value chain to the farmer-owned grain elevators and cooperatives that CoBank finances a lot of. Talk about the impacts for them. What are they going to need to be dealing with in the year ahead as a result of this crisis?
Well, they have a different business, obviously, than the producers. But if you are a grain and farm supply co-op and you have to buy lots of inventory to make sure that you have the fertilizer that your member owners need to apply to their crops and so forth, they're facing similar issues, which is, how do I get the supplies that I need from my farmers and members? How do I do that at a price that's reasonable so that I can make sure that the co-op also has an appropriate level of profitability and margin protection so that it can provide the services and products that its own members need. So they have to deal with that, as well as a significant amount of volatility, both on both sides of their business. Some co-ops have diversity of businesses. It includes agriculture or energy or other things. So it's a highly uncertain, highly volatile business environment where there's opportunities to have high quality revenues and high margins and high profitability. But the reverse is also possible because one can make missteps in a market that has this much dramatic change and volatility in it.
It seems like there's going to be a premium on good risk management, certainly for the co-ops.
That is always true, but the more there's volatility and uncertainty, the more that becomes the case.
Let's pivot over to energy, but again, through kind of this lens of rural America, and bring up yet another chart here that shows rig count for gas and oil exploration here in the U.S., which predominantly occurs in rural areas, as we all know. It has, over the past several months, well before the Ukraine crisis, been trending upward as the economy has been rebounding. What do you think's going to happen in this sector going forward, and will there be a meaningful benefit for rural areas as a result of this?
Given what we've done in this country over the last 15 years, the ability to source and increase production, and particularly in fracked wells, is extremely fast and extremely price responsive. Now, clearly, producers are going to want to capture as much margin as they can, as long as they can. On the other hand, they know they've drilled many, many holes in the ground in a lot of these fracked fields that they're not pumping. And if they have 500 holes with only 100 or 150 pumping, just to make an illustrative example, they know which are the next 50 they should pump from for any given dollar increase in oil and gas prices. So they're very efficient. They're very knowledgeable about exactly where to go to get the next marginal barrel to meet the demand of the marketplace. So my expectation is there will be a very responsive supply response in the oil and gas business, just like there is in the agricultural business. The market works. People respond to price and supply and demand incentives and signals, and they will respond accordingly. It's just that for most of us, it won't feel fast enough because you can't address the disappearance of Russian oil and gas exports in the same speed and flexibility that you can shut them off in response to their aggression in Ukraine. So it'll take some time. There will be some inflation, but overall, the oil and gas economy is quite responsive, and I expect it to continue to be so.
We've all seen the huge increase in gasoline prices at the pump over the last several weeks. What in your view is the likelihood that if that happens for a long enough period of time, it will accelerate adoption of electric vehicles, which are still a pretty small percentage of new car sales, but could there be a substitution effect over to EVs that would then have a follow-on impact on electric utilities, which we also finance, that kind of thing? What's your view on that?
As we've talked here about the fact that there's a long-term energy transition going on in the world, and that will probably go from 80% of all the world's energy being consumed in the form of fossil fuels down to, say, 40% by about 2050. That's an enormous energy transition, which will also be correlated with a vast expansion of electrification. Now, the speed at which those things happen are driven by a variety of things, including the development and adoption of technology, but also by public policy choices, right? And the reason I get to that is because the war in Ukraine has made everyone in the world who relies on fossil fuels in general and Russian fossil fuels in particular to sit up in their chair and go, wow, this vulnerability that we've known about for all this time has a whole bunch more negative externalities associated with it than we ever thought or expected to manifest. So if you're sitting in Germany, for example, they always knew that they were super vulnerable to Russia. But now they find that great vulnerability to be just completely unacceptable from a political and policy perspective. And so they are going to take, and have already taken, as has the EU, some very dramatic public policy decisions that effectively involve dramatically reducing and ultimately eliminating their reliance on fossil fuel imports from the Russian Federation, and the replacement by some combination of fossil fuels from other places and markets on the one hand, and an acceleration of the energy transition so that they can rely, they ultimately wanted to rely dramatically more on renewables. Now they want to do that even faster because that becomes an additional goal to get themselves out from under the political influence and the risks associated with the power of the Russian Federation, because the Russian Federation's revenue stream that it uses to now obviously prosecute aggressive campaigns, not just in smaller neighboring countries, but now in the largest country on the European continent other than Russia, in the case of Ukraine, is financed entirely by their fossil fuel exports, predominantly to the European Union. And they want to bring that to an even swifter conclusion.
Let's bring up a final chart and bridge to our last topic here, which is the connection between what we've been talking about and the interest rate environment that we all live in. Inflation was already an issue coming into this crisis, and then it's gotten a lot worse very quickly because of it. Earlier this week, the Fed met and hiked the federal funds rate by 25 basis points. That was widely expected. You can see here it was at zero basically throughout the entire pandemic period, but now they're starting the tightening path. What do you think the Russia-Ukraine crisis will do to the Fed's trajectory of tightening going forward?
Well, what I would say is the challenge that the Federal Reserve had before the war started in February was already quite serious, right? We already had multiple vectors of inflationary pressures, some of which are not easily solvable by monetary policy means because they're quite structural in nature on the supply side of the economy. That highly complicated problem for the Fed just got a lot more complicated because the consequences of the war in a variety of ways, some of which we've talked about here, also create additional inflationary pressures on the one hand. On the other hand, they create political and contextual pressures to not to aggressively take actions that might throw the U.S. economy into a recession more quickly. So it's making a difficult job even more difficult. And for example, energy inflation is going to be even harder to crack as a consequences of the impact that the war has in global energy markets. So it's a really big challenge. And it is, I think, becoming more likely, although I don't want to ascribe probabilities to it, that ultimately, the steps that the Fed is going to have to take to increase interest rates, because they cannot ignore statutorily, they cannot ignore inflation. They must try and bring inflation back down under control. And even if monetary policy doesn't solve the supply side problems in the economy, they're going to have to increase interest rates to bring inflation under control. And there's more likelihood, therefore, that drives us into a recessionary condition and more quickly, because of the fact that the increases in interest rates are not going to solve our labor market shortage. They're not going to solve some of the other structural problems that we have in our economy, and they're not going to solve the supply side constraints caused by further waves of COVID in China or other places in Asia, for example.
Very, very interesting. What other final thoughts would you have for us as we end here?
Well, I think we're in a highly unusual set of circumstances, as I said at the beginning. We're not fully out of COVID. It's not fully in the history books. We have a highly unusual set of macroeconomic circumstances with inflation for the first time in 25 years after trying unsuccessfully to generate inflation through a variety of means. We now have more than we ever sought or wanted, and we have a transformationally important a major war, the largest war on the European continent since 1945, that is going to have dramatic impacts on politics and economics and the way the world evolves from here. It's very unlikely to end in a Russian victory, however that might be defined. It's very much more likely to create a very tense, difficult, awkward, confusing international environment that will have some significant economic consequences, not all of which are easy to foresee. So we are bound to live in interesting times.